yeah, I call this talk Creating Accessible iOS Apps, an action plan. And the idea is that if you are just starting as an iOS engineer, or if you are an iOS engineer and you don't know much about accessibility, or you just want to know more about accessibility in iOS, it can be a bit overwhelming now that you have so many features, so many tools, so many APIs. So I try to make like an action plan to as a way to start in this amazing but massive field, to make things a bit clearer. And yeah, as Cameron said, hi, I'm Danny. I work in the amazing accessibility team at Spotify. I've been doing these tweets, posting recently in LinkedIn and Mastodon as well about tips on how to make iOS apps more accessible. And a few years ago, I wrote a book about it. I have one copy, so the first question at the end of the presentation gets a free book. And yeah, this is my plan. So it's 3 main points: voiceover, dynamic type, and good practices. So I recommend to focus on voiceover. That doesn't mean you shouldn't test your app with keyboard or switch control or voice control, but the underlying APIs that to implement a good voiceover experience are the same across all these technologies. So chances are that if you get to implement a good voiceover experience, you'll have a good experience with the other ones as well. Then dynamic type is, I think, is quite a unique feature from iOS. I love it. It's the possibility to select different text sizes in the system. You can even specify like different text sizes for different apps. And you have like 7 sizes, but you can actually enable 5 extra accessibility sizes. So it gets pretty big. And what I love from this one is I'm pretty sure it's the most widely accessibility feature used in iOS. But most people using dynamic type won't consider themselves disabled or won't consider that they're using an assistive technology. So I think it's a great reminder that if we make apps accessible, they just benefit everyone. Both my parents use large text sizes, for example, and I think most of us will probably get to that point as well. And then good practices, what I mean by that is just things that most of you may be aware of, these things that are not technically related to iOS technologies, but more things like color contrast, touch target sizes, and things like that. So let's start. And yeah, it all started in 2007 when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone. In the slide, you can see like a sketch of Steve Jobs like holding the first iPhone in his hand. And the interesting thing is that the first iPhone was not accessible. There's an audio documentary called 36 Seconds that changed everything that I totally recommend. We'll talk more about it. And there's a QR code at the end of the presentation. But yeah, it's by Shelley Brisbane, and is a great story to hear. And I think it's important because these days we think of Apple as this leading company in the field of accessibility. And it's just shocking, right, that the first iPhone wasn't accessible at all. We all know that this story has a happy ending, but I think it's a good thing to know. So yeah, let's start with VoiceOver. So if you haven't used VoiceOver before in the iPhone or iPad or Watch, or any Apple platform, it's the screen reader that comes pre-installed for free in pretty much all Apple devices. And in the iPhone, you can move your finger around the screen, and then VoiceOver will speak and announce like what you're touching. And because tapping means VoiceOver telling you what you're selecting, a double tap anywhere in the screen is an interaction. So if you are focusing on a button, a double tap will interact with that button. But more commonly, or a lot of times, users will swipe to the right to go to the next element, and then swipe to the left to go to the previous one. And yeah, it's very important to know like that there's these 2 paradigms of navigation with VoiceOver. Cool. So in the slide, as a joke, I used an Apple Newton instead of an iPhone, but there's an app to keep track of your favorite conferences. In this case, there's a text field, and it says in Spain, and there's a rating component that is 5 thumbs up. If we select this component with VoiceOver, it will say something like rating 5 of 5, adjustable, rates how much you like the conference. And this is not just a single blob of text, but it's actually 4 different properties. And these 4 different properties are really important to understand how the accessibility model works in iOS. In this case, label is rating, and that's the name of the component. Value is 5 of 5, and that can change, and it's like the state of the component. Adjustable is what is called an accessibility trait. There's 17 different traits, if I remember correctly, in UIKit. It's a bit different in SwiftUI, but most of them are the same. And it's basically like the role of the component. It kind of like tells the user and the system a bit more about how you can interact with it. And then rates how much you like the conference is what is called a hint, which is optional. You strive for not needing a hint, and for the components to be to have enough context for you to understand how to use it. But sometimes you may need some extra clarification. And users can actually skip it. It's read after a pause. So yeah, it's a good thing to have, but be mindful that not all of the users will listen to it. And the whole talk could be about accessibility labels, but just a few more things. The main issue in any iOS app is unlabeled buttons that consist of just an icon. If the button has an icon and a text as a title or just a title, the accessibility label gets inferred from that text. But if it's just an image, then you need to configure that explicitly. Otherwise, VoiceOver will say just button, for example. We'll try to figure out something that makes some sense, like the name of the image, but that's not always the case. Like sometimes we use names of images that are a bit like, random, basically. Sometimes VoiceOver will even try to figure out what the button does, and it will say something like possibly close button. But that's not a great experience, and it's just one line of text, of code, and definitely an issue that you can see in lots of apps. And then some other things like that you have to consider is a button can change meaning. So this is a simple example in the Spotify app. A play button, if you interact with it, then it's a pause button. So if you don't update the label and it still says play button, the user can be confused and think like, well, and how do I pause the music, right? And then let's check a few traits. We mentioned the button trait, which just tells the user this is an interactive thing that you can double tap in the screen to interact with it. Buttons in iOS have the button trait by default, so most of the times you don't have to configure that. But if you create a button from scratch, you actually have to specify that it's a button. And 2 very common scenarios where apps miss the button trait are table views and collection views that look like most of times like grids, where the cells you can tap to, for example, move you to another screen or to do some action. In the slide, there's a collection view, and each cell, if you tap it, you go to a podcast screen, and there's a table view, and each cell, if you tap it, you play some music. So if those don't have the button trait, the user may not know that you can do something with them. Then the heading trait is super important as well. Lots of apps miss heading traits everywhere, and it's one of my favorite quick wins to improve the experience with VoiceOver. So everything that looks like a header should have a heading trait, basically, starting with the title of the screen. And that helps the user quickly browse what they can find in the screen, like the different sections. But more importantly, or as importantly, it helps the user navigate quickly through the screen. In the slide, there are 2 sections, podcast and artists. The podcast section has 12 podcasts, so that means that if we don't have a heading configuration and the user is swiping to the right to try to find the next section, it's like 12 swipes, right? But with the heading trait, you can actually swipe once, and you go from podcast to artist with just a single interaction. We are a bit short on time, so just another one is selected, for example. In Spotify, we used to have a hard button, and that's one instance where we use the selected trait. If it was unfilled, it would say something like button. If it was filled, it would say something like selected like button. So just an example. And another important thing to know is that accessibility traits can be combined. And you can have header, for example, that is a button as well, because it's going to open like a different screen with more information about that section. Or you can have, like the example said, a button that is selected. So those are two different traits. And once you have labels and traits configured correctly, one other issue that happens a lot of times in VoiceOver is not grouping things in a logical manner, what is called usually semantic views. And to achieve good semantic views, there's 3 steps. The first one is grouping. So imagine the Twitter app, and a single tweet can have a status like the tweet was retweeted. It can have the username, it can have the user handle, the date, the tweet itself, media, there's a bunch of actions you can do, like more options, reply, retweet, like, share. So in the example in the screen, you need 11 swipes to go through one tweet to get to the next one. That's just way too much. Like usually what you like is a single swipe to go to the next tweet, to speed up navigation. So one thing you can do is to make that cell that represents a tweet an accessibility element. But that comes with some issues. The first one is that when you make something an accessibility element, you need to configure all the other properties, the label, the value, the hint, everything. So you need to think what makes sense to configure in each one of the properties that we saw before. Otherwise, VoiceOver will focus on that element, but will just not announce anything. So that's something important to know. And the third step is we talked that a single tweet can have multiple actions, like retweet, reply, share, and all those. So because those buttons are inside an accessibility element, they're not accessible anymore. So the way to solve that is with something that in iOS is called custom actions. And there's an array called accessibility custom actions, and you can basically define which actions the user can do with that element. When an element has actions, you can usually swipe up and down to rotate through those different actions. Then VoiceOver will start announcing all those, like activate, which is the default, reply, retweet, and then once you hear the one you want to interact with it, you double tap in the screen and it's done. Sometimes you need to use what's called the rotor. So if you rotate 2 fingers in a concentric point in the screen, the rotor menu appears. It's a super cool feature in iOS, and it lets you customize navigation modes. So for example, you could select actions if they're available. You can change the speed of that VoiceOver announces things. You can change the language of VoiceOver and things like that. In SwiftUI, there's a super convenient way of doing this, which is what is called in SwiftUI a modifier called accessibility element, and you can just combine all of those. And most of times, SwiftUI is smart enough to know to do all these 3 steps in just one line of code. Not all the times, and it's good to test it to see that it actually makes sense, but I think it's a really nice improvement in SwiftUI. Custom actions that we've seen are super useful as well when you can interact with some in a way that interferes with VoiceOver gestures. So for example, when you think about the mail app, you can swipe right or left to do things like flag an email or reply or delete. If you do that with VoiceOver, you're going to go to the previous element or the next element instead. So you can put those actions in custom actions. And we talked about focusing on VoiceOver first. And I wanted to show a few examples on why that I think is a good idea. So it has this snowball effect that when you improve the experience with VoiceOver, you're improving the whole accessibility of your app. In this case, in the example in the screen, there's the Twitter app that we've seen before, but using it with switch control. Switch control has the same issue if you don't group things in a logical way. And switch control, for you that you may know, is a way to use your phone with switches or as little as a single button, for example. So some users may have like a cursor that's moving around the screen, and then you can press that button to stop in a position, and then press again to show menu, and then press again to interact with that element. So you can see how navigation is quite expensive, and by grouping elements together, it becomes a much easier experience. And then when you create custom actions, they appear in what is called the switch control menu. So there's a very convenient way to interact with all those actions from the tweet in this case. Then same happens with the keyboard. You can go from one element to the other. If tweets are an accessibility element, then a single interaction is going to bring you to the next tweet instead of having to go through every single element inside the tweet. And there's a command, the Tab Z shortcut, that is going to open a menu with all the actions. So again, grouping things together, using custom actions, the experience is improved for keyboard users as well. And then voice control is a bit different. It may be a little bit of a worse experience, but it's a trade-off that I think is totally justifiable. So if you think about it, with voice control, you have to say something like show numbers, and then you'll have a tag on top of every tweet. And then you can say something like show actions for 6, for example, and then it shows a menu with all the actions, and you can say 3, and in the example of the screen, it will like that tweet. Because voice control doesn't have this issue of having like an expensive navigation, by grouping things together and hiding the custom actions, you actually have an extra step to get to the custom actions. Otherwise, a user could just say something like tap like, and then you'd have a label in every single like button in the screen, and you could say that something like tap 1, and that's it. But yeah, as you can see, it's not, I don't think the main problem here is discoverability, because not every user may know about this command of show actions, for example. And now let's talk about dynamic type. Yeah, in the slide you can see there's 4 examples, one with the extra small size, one with the default size, which is called large, extra large, and then the accessibility extra large size. And an interesting thing to know is that dynamic type is not just for larger text sizes, but also smaller ones. So it's just about user preference as well. And for the accessibility extra large, I think the interesting thing to know is that like not all these styles scale proportionally. So when you get to the maximum size, all the styles are pretty much the same size. You can still find some sense of hierarchy, but they get much closer together. And I think that's super smart, because the large title style is already quite large, but the body style is quite small. So it's fair to think that the body style is going to be to need a much higher increase of size to be readable. And in principle, it's super easy to implement, and it's just selecting a font based on a style. That's pretty much it. The issue, though, is that it's going to need some design considerations that we'll see in a minute. I've done like a graph. Actually, it's the same thing. You can see how styles come closer and closer and closer together as you increase text sizes. There's just a couple of things as well. Like you can, there's a property that lets you say this label, for example, is going to automatically scale to the text size selected by the user. I don't know why this is not on by default, but basically if you don't have it and the user changes settings while they're using your app, it's not going to adapt. You need to close the app and then open again. But if you have this property set to true, which is adjust font for content size category, it will automatically grow when the user changes this configuration. There's a bunch of really cool things you can do with dynamic type, and in this case, auto layout. And one of the things is, like, you may think sometimes, like, what's the ideal width for a line of text? If you have, for example, an iPad that is almost 13 inches and you have it in landscape, having a line of text that goes from the very left edge of the screen to the right one is just too long. And if you have multiple lines, it gets very difficult to read. And there's studies that, like, indicate, like, what's the ideal width for the line. But if you're using a large text size, it's useful to actually have the whole screen from side to side. So just for you not to have to think about it, there's what is called a content guide in iOS called Readable Content Guide, and that handles all that for you. In the iPad as well, you can have a split screen, and in that case, you want to fix the width of the screen as well, because it could break how your app looks in split screen. And another quick one, you can also make it so images also adjust automatically when the user uses an accessibility text size. So we spoke about design considerations, and the thing is that adopting dynamic type per se is not that difficult as we've seen it. But our layouts may not be designed with large text sizes in mind. An example you can see everywhere is like a table view cell that has an image and some text. So the text doesn't have the whole width of the screen, and that's a problem with large text sizes. But in iOS, you can actually check if the user is using an accessibility text size, or say, like, if it's larger than the extra large size, I'm going to do some tweaks in the layout. And a very useful trick is if you have what is called a stack view, that is a horizontal stack view with an image and a text. You could say, well, if the user wants to use an accessibility text size, I'm going to switch the axis, and now it's going to be a vertical text. So the image is going to come first, and then underneath the image you're going to have the text. And that has two benefits. One is it lets the text go from side to side of the screen, plus you can increase the number of lines, because now you can grow as much as you want. And the other trick that can help you with dynamic type is if you have a layout that has multiple columns, like the weather app tends to have 2 columns for indicating things like UV index or the sunset time or the wind or the rainfall. You can say, well, if the user is using a text size that is larger than extra large or is an accessibility text size, then let's go from 2 columns to 1. And again, that lets you use the screen much better. And then a question I get a lot of times is like, well, when you enable large text sizes, why is that Apple is not increasing the text size of the navigation bar and the tab bar? Seems like a fair thing to do. But the thing is, like, if you do that, it would take too much space of the screen, leaving very little space for content. So the workaround that is something that is called large content previews. If you're using an accessibility text size and you tap and hold your finger on the navigation bar or the tab bar, you're going to see a large preview in the middle of the screen with whatever you are tapping. So for example, if there's a navigation bar with the title Watch Now and you tap and hold, then you see the text Watch Now very big in the middle of the screen. And then we can talk about good practices. And the first one is color contrast. And I've taken this slide from one of the WWDC sessions from Apple because I think it's really smart. It shows you how white over black is a 21:1 contrast ratio, and it passes for any text size. Then there's a gray to black, which is 4.1:1, and you can see how the smaller text size is very difficult to read and it doesn't pass. And the third one is darker gray over black, which is a 2.9:1, and you can see how even the large text size is impossible to read. And that's something that in the iOS community is not super well known, that color contrast ratios are important, and also the size of the text is important as well. So I think this is super useful. And then Apple recommends to have touch target sizes of 44 by 44 points minimum. And again, I think we've all been there where you try to tap a button in an iOS app and you have to try many times till you finally hit the button. And most of the times you think it doesn't even need to look different. It's just that the size of the button is small, right? In the screen, there's an example of a player, and the bounding boxes of the buttons in the first example are right around the icons. So they're super small. The second example looks exactly the same, but the bounding boxes are bigger. And it looks the same, but it's just a much better experience for everyone. You can imagine that in apps that are going to be used with touch controls a lot of times, this is super important. And then a concept that is not super well known in the iOS community as well is the concept of multimodality. So not showing important information in just one mode, meaning color or shape or sound or haptic feedback, but a combination of all of those. Not all of those, but a combination of some of those, so all your users can perceive that information. And an example I really like to show is the shuffle button in Spotify. It used to be white when it was off and green when it was on. But then for some users that might be really difficult to perceive, the difference of those two states just by the color, if you, for example, are color blind. So what the designers at Spotify did was to add a button, a circle, and a small dot underneath the shuffle icon when it was on. So that simple change now makes it so much easier actually for everyone to identify. And it has become kind of a part of the brand of Spotify. And another thing is honor user settings. So I don't know if you remember when iOS 7 was released and Apple dropped skeuomorphism for the new and flashy flat design that now governs every single app in the world. But back in the day, apart from being a revolution in how apps looked in the phone, it was a big step back in terms of accessibility, because the fonts were super thin, the color palette had a very poor contrast. There were lots of transparencies, lots of animations, and some users really didn't feel like iOS 7 worked for them. So in iOS 8, Apple introduced at least kind of a way of fixing that, and it's just a set of user preferences. So from iOS 8, a user can request bolder text or larger text or on-off labels for switches, or to reduce the transparency of the apps, or to reduce motion, which is super important as well. And as developers, we have access to those settings. And ideally, a user wouldn't need to enable any of those settings for the app to be accessible. So ideally, the color contrast is good enough, so a user doesn't need to go to that setting. But you can offer an even better contrast for some users, right? What happens though a lot of times is a designer may say well, let's go with this color palette that is not passing WCAG guidelines, because then we can use this setting for the user to have an experience that works for them. And we should really not try not to do that. That should be just an improvement, but the baseline should be already accessible. Also, I like to say, imagine you're using your phone and you try to set on the Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, or you change the volume of your device and it doesn't work. You'd be completely mad that that's happening, right? Why a user shouldn't feel mad if you request, let's say, larger text sizes and your app doesn't do anything. And one that I like to show as well is, before dark mode was a thing in iOS, we had a feature called invert colors. So because most of the apps would be white background and a black text, or ideally black text, some dark gray text. Some users would find difficult to read it that way, to read the app that way. So they use this feature to invert the colors because they find probably easier to read white text over a black background, for example. And then Apple introduced something that is called the smart invert colors, because if you inverted the colors of the screen, the issue was that you were inverting everything, including images, and that's something that you probably didn't want to invert. It's called a smart invert, but actually, as a developer, you have to say like, actually, this image I'm going to opt out from being inverted. So it's not that smart. You have to tell it like which things you want not to invert. In the example in the slide, there's the Books app with the Steve Jobs app, and the first one is how it looks by default. The second one is the classic invert, where you can see that the book cover is inverted and is like in negative mode. And the third one, all the colors are inverted, but the cover stays as it looks in the default mode. In the iOS community, I like to say like, and more importantly, Steve Jobs' turtleneck was black but not white, so it's important to do that. So yeah, this is the plan, I think. VoiceOver first. It doesn't mean you don't have to think about the other technologies and test them. But again, like if you're just starting, if you're feeling overwhelmed, I think it's fair to say like, let's focus on something. And VoiceOver was actually the first of these technologies that I mentioned that was introduced. So I think a lot of iOS engineers have got the habit of testing with VoiceOver. Dynamic type is another one that is super important because it has, as we've seen, design considerations, and it's one of those things that if you do right from the beginning, it's not that difficult, as we've seen, but if you suddenly want to adapt a whole app to use large text sizes, then it becomes a complete nightmare, and is when accessibility sometimes gets this kind of bad reputation of being difficult. And well, it wasn't difficult. It's just that you let it it happens the same with testing, right? Like if you create a whole app and now you say, okay, now I'm going to create tests for this app. It's a lot of work because you may need to refactor things, and things may not work, and things may break, and better to have in mind from the beginning. And then all these good practices that are just things that you have to remind yourself constantly and to keep in mind when you are implementing something new as well. So again, this slide is showing how Phil Schiller in 2009, 2 years after the first iPhone was introduced, came on stage to present VoiceOver, and he spoke during 36 seconds about accessibility in iOS. And that's why the name of the documentary that I said is 36 seconds that changed everything. There was no like demo or anything. 36 seconds is not much, but it actually changed the iPhone forever. And in the slide, there's also a sketch of how the accessibility settings screen looked like. And VoiceOver was the first feature. You could zoom the screen as well. And there were 2 or 3 more features, but it was like super basic. So my point with this is, as we say a lot of times, is progress over perfection. If you feel overwhelmed, think like Apple had an inaccessible iPhone from day one, and it took 2 years for them to present the first feature, and now they're just one of the leaders of the sector. So you have to just start with something and to be persistent. And a lot of times people come to me and say, like, what's the point of implementing dynamic type in one screen if the whole app is not supporting it? They're like, well, it's a start. And if you don't implement it in that screen, it's just worse. And you're never going to have the time to tackle the issue for the whole app. So yeah, it's a way to start, and you'll see how surely but slowly, like, you're making progress and making it better and better. And yeah, just I like to say as well, like, it's It's not a one-day job. It's not a one-person's job. It's something that you just have to get used to it. You practice, and it becomes second nature fairly quickly, actually. You quickly realize, in iOS we're super lucky because we have so many great APIs, so many great tools. Some of the slides, the code was just there to show you that a lot of times these big problems are solved with a couple lines of code. And as we've said, like, the problem is when you leave it all to the end. And when someone comes to you and says, like, how do I make this accessible? And you submit a list of 50 items, and then they become like paralyzed and they think like, oh, we don't have the time to do that. But in reality, those 50 items are 50 lines of code, which is not much. It's just people don't know about it usually. So yeah, just a 360 days job. And thank you. Yeah, that was. I tried to make it on time.
Nice. Thank you, Danny. And thank you so much for your work and expertise, and for sharing that with us today. I'm going to open to questions, and we also have the live stream. So I'm going to give, Brian, right here.
Thanks. This is great, Danny. Thank you. So watching some of this, I'm struck by how much of these APIs in iOS require opt-in on the part of the developer. It's even like the dynamic type. It seems like, I've got to call a pretty long string of APIs, and what I really care about is that enum value at the end, right? .body or .heading or whatever. Is there discussion between the big adopters like yourself and the folks over at Apple to try to make these things a little bit like, why doesn't the UI text element just automatically just say, tell me what type of element this is, body, instead of having you opt in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it comes, most of the times it's just for backwards compatibility. So like, if you think that suddenly Apple says, well, now all labels are going to automatically grow, like, most of apps would break. So I guess there's this balance of, do we break all of them so we force them to fix it, but then the users are going to have the pain of not being able to use any of those apps for a long time? Probably some of them may not even care of fixing it. Or do we do it opt-in so apps voluntarily adapt when they want? It's a tricky one. I was showing in the iOS conference like 2 days ago. There's this property you have to set to false when you create UIs in iOS. It's called translates auto-resizing mask to constraints, something like that. And it's a big joke in the community because sometimes you spend minutes and minutes, hours trying to find out why your layout is not displaying as you want to, just to find out that you forgot to set that property to false. And that's kind of a legacy thing. You used to use these auto-resizing masks in iOS like back in the day, and everyone is thinking, why is this not set to true? And at some point they probably should have done that, but yeah, I think it all comes back to not breaking what you have, which is strange because sometimes Apple just forces all us to update. Yeah,
because it seems like, with the release of like Swift UI, right? Like, these are new components that people aren't already using, so there's not that much legacy stuff to worry about breaking at that point. People are going to say, oh, you're opting into using Swift UI and you have these new components. Like, there was an opportunity there to maybe bake some of this in by default.
No, I have to say that Swift UI is much more accessible by default than it is UIKit. Yeah, a lot of these things, as you said, like, they just work by default, and you actually have to opt out for them not to work. And it's just that developers tend to opt out without knowing that they're doing, like, if you specify a font like with a specific size, you're basically saying like this text is always going to be this size.
Thank you. Other questions in the room? I have a couple questions on the stream too. One of the questions from the stream is, can you share a few design patterns for the web that don't translate well to the iOS platform? I have a similar question, but
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good one. I'm not super knowledgeable about web patterns, but I guess like the most obvious one was at some point every single app had a hamburger menu that opened from the left. And nowadays, there's very rarely you find an app with that pattern. And yeah, it was just because I guess apps wanted to put every single option somewhere, but apps tend to usually be useful when they're simpler and when they're right to the point and they display or they make accessible at first hand like the most useful things. And you don't really not need to have like a list of 20 options right there. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think a lot of people come from a web background in accessibility.
Yeah.
So I see where the question is coming from, and I have a similar question about Safari on iOS respecting some of these configurations. Like, what percentage of these settings actually get passed through to the web content author? So, for example, I know Reduce Motion is a CSS media query that you can hook into as a content creator. Are there others that we should know about that are like, oh my gosh, how did I not know that I could do this in CSS when the user asked for it?
One that I know about is you can actually adopt dynamic type.
Really?
Yeah, and I can actually try to find it somewhere, because I just found it randomly somewhere that you can do it, and I think actually Apple proposed it to be standardized, but let me see.
That was actually exactly what I was hoping. Because the idea, anyone else here who works in web accessibility might be aware of reflow and resize requirements under WCAG 2.1 AA. It's a requirement that you be able to zoom text like to very large sizes and still have the application layout and content make sense loosely. So this idea of zooming everything proportionally or disproportionately makes a lot of sense. And it's something that we don't really think about as web developers. Like, what if I zoomed things out of sync, so to speak? So I thought that was a really cool insight that we could take from iOS into web. Do we have other questions in the room?
This is how it works more or less. So this one, yeah.
Amazing.
And again, I don't know much about web development, but you have this Apple system body style, Apple system headline style. So I use this sometimes for simple HTML files inside your app, like terms and conditions or privacy policy, because those make a lot of sense that scale with dynamic type as well. Although you can like zoom, but yeah, this is such a much better experience for iPhones. Do
you know if this works on? It works on iOS Safari, presumably. Does it work on Safari on macOS?
Good question. I don't know.
This is amazing. Thank you for showing me this. I'm gonna go home and play with this. Yeah. Other questions here.
A lot of apps are unfortunately just web views. Would you say there is a strong accessibility case for not building your app with a web view that those of us who are trying to deter that can use?
Right. I mean, I'm biased, completely biased, because I'm a native developer, and I actually really like developing native apps for many reasons, including performance, and I think the experience tends to be more fluid and much better. But I don't think you can make the accessibility case because the web app may be more accessible. We said, right, like a lot of engineers come from the web engineering world, and they may have much more experience in accessibility. So it just comes down to how much effort you put into making it accessible, I guess. But it's true that if you create apps, native iOS apps, the way Apple proposes or with their recommendations, things tend to be super accessible with almost no work. The problem comes when want to make things from scratch, reinvent the wheel, or just customize things to a level that Apple doesn't allow you to do, that's when accessibility gets like thrown out of the window, and you have to implement it yourself. And if you don't, take that into account, then it's broken. I like this concept of apps are accessible by default, and then we break them really.
Take another question from the stream here. Okay, so are there any new features or recommendations you'd have for future updates to the UI accessibility API? What's your dream of like a feature, accessibility feature that you want and need?
Nice. There's a good one, but difficult one as well. I'm curious about something that I heard is going to happen, and is that Apple seems to be going to release like a simplified mode or something like that.
Oh, I saw this recently. Yeah. They sneaked it somewhere. It's for the home screen. It's not just like application specific. Yeah. So what you're talking about is like a simplified mode for across all of the platform.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'm curious because, we always think you shouldn't have like two different experiences, right? Like that's just going to like make it even more difficult to maintain. But if they're doing it, I guess they might have some way of doing it with like very small effort. But it's a tricky one as well, because I can see how, again, some teams may think, well, if we have the simplified mode, then we can make as complex as we want the default app. And that's not ideal either. But let me think about a new... Apple just surprises us, I think, every year. Some recent things that they've released is like audio graphs. That's a cool feature as well.
Yeah, audio graphs are amazing too. Keep going. I'm just handing off the mic.
No, I was trying to think about, because at some point I had like a wish list, but now I just blanked. But if I can remember, I'll come back to that one.
I've been having conversations with a number of different people in the native app space, and commonly bemoaning the lack of clarity from W3C on how to map guidelines to native, and the need to fill that, like in some way with consistent and kind of approved guidance. But as you mentioned, Apple surprises us every year, Google surprises us every year, and the pace of change of the landscape is so different than it is in web standards that it's hard to create a resource that is both kind of generically applicable across use cases and able to live and not go stale, given the pace of change in the two platforms. Do you have a way that you work with your teams or coach your teams to translate and apply those guidelines in a way that you feel is consistent and kind of scalable? Because I feel like a lot of us are all doing that work in silos, because there's no kind of global guidance, and everybody's kind of doing their own work in the context of their own business, but not in a way that really scales or kind of spans across the use cases and across the platforms. So do you have any thoughts other than like, we just all need to form our own working group and go do it, on how to kind of consistently apply those when it comes to native?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you're completely right. Like standardization is always behind like real world use cases and technologies. I think we're moving in the right direction though. The closest thing I've seen is a few years ago I used to work for the BBC, and they started a great job of like having like a simplified version of the guidelines, and also taking mobile into account. They had even like code snippets and tips on how to test those scenarios. To me, that's the closest we've got to something like that. It's just that unfortunately I don't see it's maintained a lot. yeah, but so as you said, like maybe we need to all team up and work with the BBC to. in Spotify, we tend to work, but again, as you said, like we may like work in silos. We tend to work a lot with the system design language teams to make sure that those guidelines are baked in the basic components from the ground up. So when an engineer comes to use one of those components, they almost don't have to think about these things.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of folks on the website will say, regardless of what framework you're working in, JavaScript framework, you always have native semantics to fall back on, and you can get a lot of the accessibility behavior that's intended, quote unquote, for free if you leverage native semantics and native components. When we're talking about, and that's for HTML native, when we're talking about native app cross-platform frameworks like Flutter or .NET MAUI or React Native, a lot of them, Flutter, for example, has its own approach to accessibility, but you can't actually go native in the same way. Like you can't fall back to the native accessibility traits. So I feel like it's not even just two native platforms that we have to keep up with, but it's all of the ways that the cross-platform frameworks compile down to native. And obviously, native Swift, native Objective-C is one use case, but for those of us that end up in all the different frameworks and doing work in all the different frameworks, it's an interesting nut to crack.
No, it is. And a lot of times as well, people tend to think about mobile as just you said, like one thing, and you have mobile native. In that you have iOS and Android, and you have mobile web, and in that you have like a whole different story. You have all these cross-platform technologies. I remember working with React Native, and I believe they're getting much better. But like someone told me to implement a way of being able to select some text. And it turns out that the text component in React Native implements underneath a UI label, which doesn't let you select text, at least select from, like, you can select the whole thing, but not like part of it. So it was pretty much impossible. Like, it was such a huge task that it didn't make sense. And I can see how a lot of times you can have similar things with accessibility, and as you said, like, because you cannot get to the native aspect of it, like, you can just wish for them to implement it one day. And I think dynamic type is a great example of what we're talking about, like this guideline of having at least a 200% increase of the text size, like, doesn't really apply, but you can argue that dynamic type is a very, very good experience as well. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
All right, so I want to give the room one last opportunity to ask questions. Okay. Well, I neglected at the beginning of our conversation, of our talk, to say thank you to some people. In particular, Meryl Evans, who is not here today, but helps co-organize the meetup. Yeah, Meryl. Thomas and Sean. She's here virtually. Hi, Meryl. Love you. And Thomas, Meryl, Sean, and Joseph, who helped co-organize the meetup. Mirabai Knight, who is our amazing captioner on the other end of the screen. Thank you, Mirabai. And also...
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.